Thank you, Chris. And wow, are the cookies this good? It's Friday. Have you not noticed? I don't usually get crowds like this on a Friday afternoon. So anyway, thank you all for making the time for this. And thank you to Kathy for having me here for a whole month. It's been really wonderful to be at the university. And I see many, by now, familiar faces. So it's been great to meet with you all and have time. So I'm going to speak to adaptation, a theme that many of you here are in some ways working on. And I want to introduce to you something that is sort of a conceptual framework for how to maybe think about adaptation success. But I'm going to do that with an example from the coast, or with lots of examples, and focus on the coast. And you might wonder, why in the world is she going to give a talk about the coast in Tucson? So I'm going to try to make that clear in my first part of this story. And it gets actually back to something that Kathy and I and many of you here in the room have worked on for a long time, which is the National Climate Assessment. I was one of the convening lead authors of the coastal chapter, and we came up with some messages that make the point of why it matters even to you here in Tucson. And then I'm going to actually try to prompt you to kind of imagine for yourself what you would consider success in adaptation. And give you examples mostly from the coast, but you get the idea. Introduce to you why it matters, the key dimensions that we've come up with in a project that I'll report on, and then actually focus on what role does science have in helping to define and measure and track what success is. And that, I hope, will generate some good discussion, because we're all, this whole time for me here has been about the question of linking science to policy in some ways. So, actually, one more thank you before I start. This work is certainly not one that I've done by myself. Some of you may know Max Boykoff. He is in Boulder, Colorado, and we have worked together on a book that you see depicted here, Successful Adaptation to Climate Change. That's what got me started, to just think about this. And we looked actually across many sectors and got sort of at the challenges involved in thinking about success in that book. It didn't go far enough to say, and here's exactly how we measure it, and here's how we track it. But we then took this crowd of people here that you see, some of them geographers from Stanford, from University of Washington, and from Oregon State University. Hannah Gosnell is one of the geographers on this project. We then basically tried to actually take it into a context, the coast, on the West Coast. Go ahead. To get real with this, and to really understand how would both scientists and practitioners, managers, coastal managers, planners, engineers, how would they think about success? In fact, that whole project got started because a planner asked me, how do we know we're succeeding? Which is really a hard question to answer. And so that's what I'm going to focus the meat of my presentation on. But let me start here. So you're all in Tucson, and you might wonder, why the hell? Why the hell would you be interested in anything that happens to the coast? It's hot here, there's no water. You have trouble enough, don't you? Well, this is my nod to geography. And it gets at one of the pet peeves out there in the world of geography. All adaptation is local. And I'm here to tell you it is not. It never is. It never is just local. Whatever you do here depends on the risks and the vulnerabilities and the adaptive capacity and the resilience that is all linked to other places, far distant places. And these are simply unavoidable links in a both politically federated system like we have in the United States on all environmental management, and in an economically globalized world, in a culturally globalized world. Sometimes these links are helpful. They help us adapt better. And sometimes they actually are problematic. Sometimes they're unfavorable, necessary. And so I want to give you an example from the National Climate Assessment of how this is true. This is one of the key findings from the coastal chapter that I co-led, that I just mentioned. Coastal impacts cause far-reaching economic disruption. Now, all of you have been around when Katrina happened. All of you have witnessed Sandy. You take any major environmental disaster that we've had, and it has had far-reaching impacts. I'll give you an example that happened far away from us here, and yet had significant impact on the United States. So in 2011 in Thailand, there were some major floods They cost $45 billion in total economic damages, only a small fraction of which was actually in Thailand. You know, it impacted the buildings that got flooded and whatever that was happening right there. But importantly, those were factories that built the chips that we all need in cars, in cameras, in computers. And Silicon Valley had a really hard time. That season was a heavily impacted season in terms of their production cycle because they had basically put all their chips in one basket, if you will, and essentially been really hit hard by these faraway links. And so this is just one example. I'll give you one that you all must relate to and brings it back to Tucson. Did you use any of these things this morning so far today? 90% of every consumer good that we use in this country comes through one of the ports. You will want to know that these ports are prepared for climate change if you care to consume or eat or whatever you might want to do. Have a coffee. Really crucial things. So this is really important, and here is an example of this that comes from the National Climate Assessments. These are just some key ports that we pointed out. We could have done this for every single port in this country and looked at the tonnage of what is transported from them to other places in the United States. Houston, one of the largest ports, or the largest ports in the Gulf, touches 31 states with the products that it transports inland. So this is just, you know, the heaviest ones that you can actually show on a map like this at this scale. Same here, you can see it from LA or from even New York City affects what we do here. So you want to pay attention to what happens at the coast. It does matter to your lives here. Here's another example. This shows the storm tracks of blue was Katrina and red was Hurricane Rita, 2005, and what the red dots are the oil production platforms in the Gulf. Now, when those two hurricanes went through, the platforms were shut down for a considerable amount of time, which affected about 30% of the energy production in this country. A third. That's a lot. So we might want to care about whether or not these industries, these communities are prepared to deal with this. And this is the way this then translates to the rest of us through transportation infrastructure, communication, energy, and water infrastructure. And in fact, what you see here depicted are water is always a good example on the coast. It's at the lowest point because most of them are gravity fed. So those are the first ones that actually feel the impacts of sea level rise or storms. Many of the roads that lead inland that help people get out will be affected, and that of course affects then long-term transport, long-term migration patterns. So this is just an example of how we are connected to the coast and why it matters. You all remember these pictures. That's on a not-so-sunny day. And I think the important piece, and this is another key message from our chapter, is that this is not something in 100 years from now. We used to talk about it as climate change or sea level rise in 100 years is whatever, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. These are pictures of things happening today in coastal arenas. This is Charleston, South Carolina, where the water comes up through the sewer system, the erosion wiping out streets. This is Annapolis, Maryland. So it's not just the extreme events. It is also, the sort of nuisance flooding, the gradual stuff that affects the functioning of these communities. And it's not looking so good in terms of seeing how this goes. So what you've seen, these pictures, is what has happened with about 8 inches of sea level rise over the last century. And it is going anywhere only up from here. Best case scenario, if you will, is if it's just maybe double the historical record, about a foot or so. Quite likely it could go significantly higher. We have a fan that is even going to higher numbers, as you can see here. This figure, I can tell you, has been fought over very hard. I see Kathy smiling. She was probably part of these discussions at infinitum. This is a very difficult number to derive at. And the reason for that, as of course many of you know, or most of you know, is that part of the problem is just the warming up of the oceans, and that is actually the factor that we can predict fairly well. What we can't understand really well yet, or don't understand very well yet, is the behavior of the major ice sheets. So sea level rise is the combination of the increase of the volume of the water already in the ocean basins, plus basically the added water from melting of ice on land. And depending on how fast that happens, that number is at least, in that upper range. And if you track this type of science, you will know that things are not looking so great. I think it's probably not very realistic to plan for just a foot over 100 years, in my personal estimation. But that's what the science says right now. So, given that we are in coastal areas basically facing guaranteed loss of some kind, a lot of money and or ecosystems and or money and infrastructure. I don't know, just to give you another number, there's about $1 trillion or more in real estate investment on the east coast of the United States. $1 trillion in the direct path of the kinds of sea level rise and 100-year flooding that I just described to you. So in the face of that scenario, how can we even talk about success? What might that look like? Okay, so is it maybe this, where we're just well prepared, when the storm comes, whatever, we get out of town? Is that maybe your version of success? Or as in this image here of Norfolk, Virginia, that looks more at the not so, storm-related issues, but this is kind of beautiful weather, nice weather kind of thing where I love this quote from this minister of a church there. Said basically our church has to put the tide chart on the schedule for whether or not people can come to church. So, it's already affecting businesses, access to homes, where you can park or not at certain times. So is it maybe just putting up the tide chart on our websites? Or is it like this, where we protect at all costs what we have right now? I mean, this is, San Diego, Monterey Bay. People live there, they love the coast, and they obviously have invested quite considerably in those homes. Is it reasonable to say success is to protect that? Of course, at the expense of losing the beach in front of it? Or is it, we're going to just fix this one way or another? Major gates in front of the Thames River in London, plugging up the entrances to the metro in New York, or putting, like the Dutch do, houses simply on platforms that float up and down. Is that what success looks like? Or are you of the flavor that likes green solutions? This is the salt ponds in San Francisco. It actually does look like that. I don't know if you've ever flown over it. It's very fabulous. Anyway, or restoration of wetlands, dunes, that sort of thing. Is that maybe the way we would prefer success to look like? I'll give you this example. You might wonder, what does that have to do with success with the coast? Well, in some of the coastal areas in California where many of us get our favorite wines from, there are some pretty severe things happening right now. In coastal forest, there's clear cutting going on, and it is to make room for vineyards. Why? Because Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley are not doing so well with the changing climate. So if it's not good there, so then let's just go somewhere else, right? And this is the result. Is that what it looks like? Well, as you can see, some people are quite upset about destroying the redwoods for the wine. So if we can't have it both ways, then maybe the only thing that we really need is a good process, where people get to sit at the table and they figure it out and they duke it out, and I don't know what they do, but basically, come have everyone who has a say at the table and work out those issues. Is it basically we should think about success as a good process? Or like this. It's one of my favorite pictures. It just shows, this is like, I could have given you any disaster ever that happened in this country, this American defiance. When something happens, like literally 15 minutes later, the American flag goes up. This is a good example too. I don't know if you noticed, but for the first time since 1888, Wall Street was closed for 2 consecutive days, ever, for weather-related reasons, after Sandy. 2 days, and they were back up and running, which is, of course, of global significance given what happens at Wall Street. Meanwhile, I'll just mention that for those of you who didn't pay attention to that, there were still elderly people in high-rises who had not yet been reached to be fed since the lights went out the night it happened. Or is it just get used to it? You know, change happens. So we do our dugong and air pollution that is, you know, terrifying. Or we just put up a sign that says, you know, salt water is corrosive to your car. So is that maybe what success looks like? Good question. I think this raises a lot of questions, many of which I think are just right for a geographer, but not only for geographers to answer. One of them is, and this is the one that I want to get at a little bit today, is, you know, is it just all subjective sort of stuff, or does science actually have a role in figuring this out? What's the right scale? Should we all look at one community after another? Should we look at the state? Should we look at the national level? Where is the right scale? Or bioregions, whatever. You carve out your scale, whatever your preference. How do we integrate? So if I do well in the coastal arena, should I care about whether or not that has any implications for the water sector or biodiversity or for health or transportation? Or how do I, you know, how do we integrate that? If, you know, like in the case with the forest and the wineries, when things aren't exactly zero-sum games, how do we deal with the trade-offs? When should we declare success? In 5 years, 10 years? You know, at the end of a budget cycle, at the end of a research project? Like, what's a good time to say, now we're good? How to measure it, of course, and who gets to say? I think that's a really critical question. Now, let me start out by, before I get into our framework and how we got to it, to say, you know, why is this important? I mean, I've given you all the reasons why you should care about, you know, the coast here in Tucson. But why bother with the question of success? Well, one of them actually has to do with communication and engagement. In many adaptation efforts, people aren't just working, you know, within one community or within department. They work with their neighboring communities, with people downstream, upstream, with peoples in the region to figure this out. And to have a common vision toward which everyone works, it's actually a really helpful thing to have. So it's actually a strategic tool to know about that. And the other piece is that it's actually a lot easier, and I come to this with bleeding hides here, because I've spent much of my time thinking about uncertainty and barriers and limits and all the negative stuff. It's not very engaging for most people. They much rather talk about succeeding. So it actually helps in getting people around the table and keep the hope up in the face of really challenging issues. Another part has to do with sort of those of us who believe that, you know, there is deliberate, rational planning, that if you want to get there, to set clear goals and then align your means and to that end makes a lot of sense. So it's basically that you're consistent with in what you're doing to reaching that. But it's also to make sure that whatever you're doing fits with other policy goals. Many, as we know, in the climate adaptation arena don't just start because of climate change. They do this in the context of hazard mitigation planning more generally, or economic development, or general planning. So how does what you do fit with that? And it just simply helps to know what you're aiming for to do that. This is the reason that most of them will basically tell you, if you ask your city council, your whatever Congress or something to give you money, well, you better say, here is what it's for. There's a good reason why we want to spend $1 million or 10 million or whatever it is. So having that justification helps a lot. And once you've spent the money, people actually want to know, well, what did you do with it? Did it work? So the kind of after-the-fact accountability of how you managed that, what you accomplished, and showing that, you know, in a time when people are quite skeptical of government, that you actually did due diligence with your funds. And then finally, as many of us in the academic community have been saying for a long time, you know, you actually want to track what you're doing and whether it's working. It helps us learn to simply improve on our practices and update what we do, see when it's no longer working, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the background to how we got into trying to design a framework for thinking about success. Well, like a good academic, I went to the library and tried to figure out how have people so far thought about this. And it's quite, you know, I would say there's two waves of interest in it. The first one, and I don't know, any of you who have paid any attention to adaptation will know about this. There are just about 2 gazillion documents that say, here's how to make a plan, you know, for adaptation, like all these best practices guides of adaptation planning, from ICLEI to, you know, any of the development agencies across the world. that was the first thing. Much attention on here's how you do the planning for adaptation. And then a very different body of knowledge that actually focused on sort of good decision making. And what I mean by that is, you know, do you have the right science to inform your decisions? Have you set the right criteria? Have you gotten everybody on the same page with your criteria? And, you know, has it been transparent? That sort of thing. That's the literature that looks at basically, are you making the right choice between option A of adaptation and option B? Now, more recently, and this is a wave I would say is probably since the fourth assessment of the IPCC in 2007, you see a lot more interest in, do we like what comes out of it at the end? Do we like the environment? Do we like the coast? I mean, this is not just coastal, this is more broader in terms of the subjective or normative dimension of this, because people realize that it's not just science, obviously, making these kinds of choices. So that's basically what the science had to tell us when we started. And it became very clear, actually, that things aren't so simple. And one of the ones, and people in the practice world think this is getting way too much in the weeds, but I think it's actually quite critical. Here's why. When you look at what people say, you know, we want to do for adaptation, what they mean by that tells you a lot about who should be at the table, what are going to be the stakeholder, you know, concerns, what are going to be the trade-offs, what analysis do you need, and what are you aiming for. One of them is what, you know, Hallie Eakin and colleagues have called a structural interpretation of adaptation, which is basically, in my translation, in my attempts to speak to people in the practice world, keep what you got. People who basically will do anything to, you know, build a seawall or, you know, come up with technological solutions where we adapt the environment so that we can have what we have. It's not about us changing ourselves necessarily. It's about changing the environment. That's one. Now imagine who needs to be at the table when this is the conversation. What are going to be the trade-offs that will be discussed in this circumstance? What are going to be the goals? When would you declare success? If you build it and you keep those houses, basically, that are behind the seawall, is that success? There's a different interpretation, which Hallie and others have called the vulnerability interpretation, and that is in many ways making a better world in terms of a more just, a socially more just world. You know, whether or not you have this kind of sort of middle income, higher income versus very low income kind of community makes a huge difference as to who ought to be at the table, who's concerned with the question of success, and what kind of analysis matters, that sort of thing. The final interpretation that Hallie and others have come up with is what they call the resilience interpretation. By that they mean actually the social ecological resilience thinking, where you look at the persistence of large-scale socio-ecological systems in their entirety, not just, you know, in one little plot, whatever. And you're interested in its long-term survival and persistence. Now, what's interesting about this, in this interpretation, is that you actually would accept smaller scale disasters, as long as you can basically come back alive. Now, this politically is, it is a political disaster to buy this in this particular interpretation. And I will say that, you know, everybody and their uncle right now talks about resilience, no matter what they you know, do out there. And I think they mean this, and they mean this, and they mean this. So it's actually really important that you have a conversation with people about what do you mean? What do you really want out there? So but it makes a really big difference as to how we would define success, as you can see from this. And then it gets pretty challenging from there. So pragmatically, very few adaptation projects have been out there that have set clear goals and that have established baselines. As Diana and others have many times said, that if you want to know whether you're making any difference, well, you better know where you start from and what you're aiming for and whether your intervention actually made a difference, right? Otherwise, you can claim all kinds of things, but you might not be able to claim success. Most of the projects are actually not far enough in terms of being implemented. And while many of them call for monitoring and evaluation, very few of them actually do. And that has to do with that we don't fund monitoring and adaptation. It's boring. It's not sexy. So you could kind of, sometimes in ecological context, you get maybe 5 years of monitoring, but that doesn't happen very often, and it's virtually non-existent for any social indicators. There are the common evaluation challenges, which simply has to do with when do you do it, who gets to say, how do you do it, how do you establish causality, what I just explained, and then simply dealing with the normative aspects of that. Now you might say, that's fine and good, but really what I care about is that we simply can continue to cope with that. And I'm just using here a graphic that has come up in other publications, but the idea is that in some ways there's already a degree of societal adaptation right now, right? You already have irrigation, you already have whatever what Cassie has all created here. You all have water right now in her former life as a water manager in the state of Arizona. So we already have put in place all kinds of mechanisms, insurance, regulations, whatever, that help us deal with the environmental vagaries, the squiggly lines that you see there. Now, once they change, that's the key issue. It would be fine if it gets, if the squigglies, if you will, of environmental extremes get wider, heavier droughts, more floods, whatever, as long as the coping range opens up with it. If we stay current with that, maybe we're good. On the other hand, what if it directionally changes? That would be an important thing to know. You would want to know in what direction it changes. And of course, in that first case, what you saw there is that it might very well be for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change, but say there is not enough money. There is a financial crisis all over the country or something. We don't have the money to keep basically our coping ability at the level where it's at. So, this one is a particularly serious case. This one is hard to implement. This one is also hard to implement because you need to know underlying science, where are we going? And with extremes, that's actually one of the harder things to do. And of course, it's also not black and white. This builds on some work that Roger Casperson and colleagues have done, and I've extended it a little bit, and I'll come back to that when I talk about the case studies. There is the case where we could do something in terms of adaptation that actually makes the situation worse. Maladaptation. We could also do something that's just not enough. Nice attempt, but it just simply doesn't cut the chase, and I would say putting plastic over snow so we can all keep skiing is a good example of that. Stabilization of a degrading situation is a good idea that at least gets us somewhere, but of course, the climate keeps changing, so we will have to continue doing that. Repair and recovery is even better than that, and maybe what we really need to do is do something different and better altogether. So success falls along this continuum, and I think it's, you will probably in any one project find that for someone, they find it's maladaptation or not enough, and for someone it's better, and for someone it might be, just okay. So you will get different responses within one and the same. Let me do one last thing here, and that's the temporal dimension to make this complicated. So let's just assume here, these are just points in time, t, 1, 2, 3, 4. And at each one of them, the conditions change in such a way that you feel like you have to actually change your adaptive options. So those are thresholds. Maybe in the coastal context, you might say, the sea level is at a certain point, and then here it's at a higher point, and then here it's yet a higher point. And they depend really on whatever adaptive option you have, whether or not it's still working relative to, say, sea level rise or storm surge or whatever your threshold might be. This is your adaptation pathway. So in other words, you're not just doing one thing and then you can go home. You will have to continue to do something as long as the environment is constantly changing. And here's just an example of that. So say you're in the state of North Carolina and you've had a setback requirement that basically took account of the fact that there is erosion happening, storm surges happen. So you had that, and it worked until from 1972 till about the year 2000, say. At that point, that 30-year setback with the erosion was all of a sudden here, and my house was still here. It hasn't gone away, and so now I want a bulkhead. I want, a seawall or something like that. Well, so you might put that in if you, well, you had to be outside of North Carolina to do that, but just to give you an example, it's not allowed there. It works for a while, and you lose all the beach, and then a bigger storm comes, and you actually feel like, well, that seawall wasn't high enough, apparently, so I need a higher one. And eventually you'll realize that even that doesn't work, and you better get the hell out. And so then you get managed retreat, unmanaged retreat. So in terms of when to think, when to start thinking about what do I need when I get to the next threshold, that depends on what you might consider. So, going from a seawall to a higher seawall may not be such a big deal, but you might need to actually build it. You need to get the permits. You might have to deal with lawsuits, whatever. That might take some time to make it happen. So this time, minus the time to make it happen, is when you should start. Well, that was yesterday in most instances, right? So oftentimes we're already behind. There's already a time lag sort of built into it. But you can, as a forward-looking planner, you could actually plan for that and say, we're going to be fine for the next 10, 20 years. But in 20 years, I need whatever major adaptation option. I better get my public to buy into that. I better get the technology in place. I get the planning in place and the money in place. All of that takes time. So we need to start thinking about, way in advance of needing it, when to start it, how to do it, if we want to actually succeed in having it in place by the time we need it. The question, of course, then is, when that first seawall doesn't work anymore, is that a failure? Is that a success? Is that, whatever? Along a pathway where something will simply run out of working anymore, it will be a matter of, you're in a path of doing all kinds of things, and not any one is a failure, not any one is a success. So there's a temporal dimension to this that makes it incredibly difficult to decide. Whoops, I don't know why I did that. So now that was all theoretical and conceptual. Now let's take it to the real world. So we did this project on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California. If you know anything about those three states, they have hugely diverse coastlines, from the likes of LA to the wild coast of Big Sur, to the wild coast of Northern California, to a coast that has been managed in very, very different ways in Oregon. It's mostly a rural coast it's a really great example of a legacy of land use history that has made much less at stake, if you will, or allowed much less to be at stake than, say, in California, where people were allowed to, build right on the cliff, build right on the beach, to the estuaries and highly urban and totally wild coasts of Washington State. So, Puget Sound with Seattle to the Olympic Peninsula. Very different circumstances. So, in that context, we basically asked practitioners to help us think through that. What is success in your context? What makes sense here? I'll give you 3 examples, one from each state. We had several examples from each, but I'll give you these examples because they show you the tricky nature of it. So Snohomish County in Washington decided they would approach adaptation by basically, weaving it into their hazard mitigation planning, which is one of the typical ways in which many communities begin to do that. They started to plan in 2005, didn't mention climate change. By 2010, climate change had risen on their agenda, and they wrote that into that plan. They're currently working on an update, and climate change is now front and center, but it is embedded in the ways of thinking and managing in which, basically Snohomish has been doing that with hazards all along. What they say was a rising success basically is that they raised awareness and interest in climate change because they linked it to something that people cared about. It didn't get stalled into, is it caused by people or not by people? They just said, this is happening, and we got to basically pay attention to it because these rainfalls or these coastal storms happen, and we need to deal with them. It was economically efficient in that they basically had the money to do it. They had a budget for hazard mitigation planning. They could get federal funds to do that. So it was perfect. And it was politically expedient because there is not a politician in the world that will say, no, no, you don't have to plan for disasters. You know, it was basically, they just all bought into it. So it was a rising success. And this is how they feel. They are actually reducing vulnerability. But one of the impacts of that, if you reduce vulnerability, is you don't have a media-happy disaster happening on your turf. If you actually succeed and nothing really bad happens, then the public can go to sleep. You get lower political buy-in because why do we need to deal with this? Oh, come on, everything's fine here, right? And it's going to be incredibly difficult to get further FEMA funding to maintain it. Those are the realities, and those are the ones that made them actually quite afraid of succeeding. So in some ways, you could say the more they succeed, the more they fail. That's the practical reality. Here is another case where it was just the other way around. We had a hard time getting anyone from Oregon to actually tell us a story because they just felt like, man, nothing's happening here. We just failed completely. Well, there's this NGO, the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition, that basically wanted to develop a model for how to do adaptation planning at the county level, at the local community level. And so they started a pilot project in Newport, Oregon, and launched this major project. And then, you know, when they came and told us the story, they said, well, it's paused. But really what they meant is that and they felt like this completely, that it had failed because they could not get anybody to show up for the meetings. They could not get anybody to pay for it. They had no political support, lack of experience in how to do it, and they could just not get anybody to commit to it. And so they said, sorry. And people in the workshop with the practitioners got up and said, this is fabulous. I was like, what? They felt like they completely failed. And you know, the people in the workshop who didn't know, who were not involved in this, thought this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, why? Because they learned from it. And they said, you know what? We had the right people in the room. Why don't you bring your idea and we build it into this regional initiative that is all focused on resilience building along the coast. And they basically took all the lessons from this and changed the process of this regional resilience initiative. And they thought it was fabulous. So here is a case where failure comes up to be success. And the last example I give you is from California, where the focus was on the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they basically hired someone a few years back to basically say, you know, come, you be our person for climate change. And this was a go-getter woman, and she basically said, you know, that's fine. I want to do that. I want to take that job. And she started to build a plan. This is the vision for the department. But it didn't go anywhere. And so she said, you know, the reason why it's not going anywhere is because it's in no one's job description to do climate change. I'm the hired person to do it. Well, they can all say, oh, let her do that. So basically, this was a case where she decided, I need to change the culture of the entire agency to begin thinking about this. They breathe it, they live it, they just work through everything. So she built something called the Climate College, which ended up being an open course, not just for the department, but for other state agencies, for NGOs, for others in the region, where basically she taught people, brought in experts, and basically did a certificate sort of thing on climate change, and it started to really change the conversations. And the way she learned is that, A, not everyone came to her anymore, or invited just her to think about it, and she overheard people talking at the water cooler. Measures of success, what you hear at the water cooler. Now, you might think, well, that's fabulous, right? So they just established this, and basically they have now, people who think about it, who do this all the time. And her boss is giving her the hardest time because, show me the money, show me the success. And she said, well, the water cooler, well, that is not good enough. The way success is measured in that agency is by shovel-ready projects being implemented, and that's the only thing that matters to them. So there's more cultural change to happen. But in this, it's a good example of, if we can't see it, if it happens in people's minds, is that success? So after these case studies, we actually held workshops with the practitioners in each of these states, and we asked them, to think about these case studies. We had 3 in each state. We had group discussions, in-depth exploration of each of these issues that we just talked about, and evaluation of this, and are writing up the synthesis of that. We also had really interesting pre-workshop conversations, and so we asked them, so what is success for you? And this was the most dominant answer. And then they all dug deeper, and in fact, we're just grouping these answers into categories. This is basically what people talked about. One is that you build the capacity and basically give people a place to start and help them see where they can start. So very much building the capacity. A second one was just to see that something gets done. And that's the typical thing actually that you most often see cited. We did pass the plan. We did do one shovel-ready project. So certainly, recognition for that something happens every year is a really important thing. How it's done, the approach, the process, the people. It's probably the most important one in terms of what people actually felt made the difference in whether or not anything happened. Is who is there, how do they lead, that sort of thing. Making sure that you can't just tell people, oh, you do this one thing and they go home, but that there is a process that keeps going and that you establish an institutional framework for an ongoing process. And then finally the question of how does it look in the end? What people wanted is to say, in 20 years I still want to eat oysters. Things like that, right? So people have very concrete ideas, and I want to come back to this outcome question because it is something that maybe most of us worry about, in terms of actually what we see on the ground. And I found there's 3 categories of what people really care about. The first one is that people actually tell you they want something better than what we already have. In other words, adaptation is not just to climate change, to something that's happening, but it is actually creating a better something. To me, this tells me that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the current situation. That's the people who answer, I want something better. And of course, if you're living in New Orleans, still not really repaired or recovered, you would see why. Well, and if we can have something better, at least I want to keep what we have. That's the sort of second best, actually. This is truly the first thing most people mention. They want to have something better, and then if that's not possible, I want to at least keep what I have. The gorgeous view, the beautiful, whatever, beaches and all that stuff. And interestingly, there's a third category after that, and that is, if I can't keep what I have, if I can't have something better, at least I want to have a dignified way out. And that's really important. There are already places in this country, in Alaska, in Louisiana, where people simply will lose their house. They have already lost their houses, they have already lost their ancestral land, they have already lost their livelihoods in those places. And I don't know, do you guys recognize what this comes from? Beasts of the Southern Wild. Probably one of the best adaptation movies out there to date. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But the reason I put this particular picture there, it's the last scene from the movie, one of the last scenes, and it shows the people who lived in the bathtub, which is this bayou in southern Louisiana that is being swamped by hurricanes and land under and all the rest of it. Basically, first they get forced out and they resist. And eventually they decide it's in their best interest to leave, but on their own terms. And this is what you see here basically is them holding up a flag. This is like people who have their dignity left in leaving if they have to. I see this a lot or have heard it a lot in comments from people in focus groups, in people in areas that are most affected already. So the indigenous peoples or people in these sort of, where climate change is basically already doing the worst damage. You hear it in stories from small island states in the Pacific and so on and so forth. So those are the 3 successful outcomes, I guess, that we can get. So out of all of this, we basically refined that simple 3-box model that I showed you earlier of process, decisions, and outcomes, and added in This was the two that were already there, added in the implementation, that something gets done, something on the outcomes that was there already, but also that people actually successfully overcome barriers, be they financial, institutional, social, political, whatever they are, and that they have the capacity to do that. And I want to say, what you need right now to do that will be different in 10 years or in 50 years. And the same is true for the capacity. So these are not like set categories that you can track forever, just that, and see whether it happens. And of course, this presumes that this is an ongoing process, and that was an important element, that is established as an ongoing process. Now, so what role for science in that? How far can I go before you throw me? Okay, I'll do this quite quickly here. So what's the role in science in figuring this out? I'm going to draw here very quickly on some old thinking, very good thinking though. Many of you will be familiar with this, about the kinds of knowledge we have and what research we can draw on to do that. So Habermas distinguished the technical, the practical, and the emancipatory, and then got at these different types of knowledge. Of course, it's easy to see, and I'll give you an example for each to see in what ways this applies to the question of success. One of them has to do with figuring out indicators of success. And I think this is a great example of where sort of this, if you go back to this, the positivist science can really help a lot in trying to figure this out. And I would say we need to think very carefully about which indicators actually matter and that they match the purpose. I'll just put this up here. You see in this column the 5 basic reasons that I mentioned earlier for why to think about success. For each one of these, you would have different indicators or metrics of success. So I think it's important that depending on why you want that, if say you want to justify your adaptation expenditures, you will look at different things and how well they're being done than say you want to communicate and get everyone on the same page. If we just measure whatever, these things, but we want to do something else, we might actually, people will just not pay attention, it doesn't matter, we will not basically listen to that, or it will not matter to us. So you have to match the indicator with the purpose for which they're used to be successful. And I think science has a lot to say on each one of these, and there's plenty of work that needs to be done to figure that out. Now, I'm going to use Pilke's work for a moment to give another example of where we might be helping out with adaptation. We already mentioned that there is sort of these normative dimensions to it. And of course, Pilke has said a lot about the role of science in society, right? Many of you have seen this, where basically he crosses the visions of democracy with a view of science and the role it plays within it. And one of the key things that he has pointed us to, and what he thinks probably is one of the most important roles in a politically sensitive issue like climate change or adaptation, is that one important role for science is to be an honest broker, where basically you recognize that the science isn't value-free, and that you can help clarify what the choices are to the different decision makers in this case. But many times, and he has quite an issue with that in highly politicized environments, what we do is that we are really issue advocates with our science. And he calls that particular case the tornado politics, where basically we are constantly in crisis rhetoric. My God, the world is falling, Sandy has just wiped us out, we need to act now. And we sort of suspend very robust societal debate about these pathways. We just say, the science says. Well, the science doesn't say anything, but basically this is where we turn into issue advocates. But in many cases, society is very much driven by disasters. That is again and again the situation we find ourselves in. So maybe we have to learn how to play tornado politics much more effectively. I think there's maybe something else. I don't know if some of you might have seen this commentary lately by Wnecessary in Nature Climate Change, where basically she says, we need to go beyond those simplistic, relatively simplistic models, and explore a range of what she calls value, means, ends packages. So in other words, we're not just here to do physical science or economic science or whatever, or even just social science, but to help the stakeholders explore and understand what are the values that inform why we chose certain means and certain ends. And then have them basically feed that into the discussion in public debate. Now, just to quickly wrap this up, I think what Pilke is correct in is that knowledge in a public and private, a public and political sphere is always a strategic means, always a strategic goal. I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't see that. You are always feeding into a political process, and by that I don't mean big capital P. Simply you are in the sphere of the polis, of the public. And that means that no knowledge is inherently valuable, no knowledge is inherently certain enough or decision relevant. You have to make it so. It can become that, and there is no magic to that. There's actually strategy and very degrees of sophistication to that. This is how we always sort of think about this. We basically provide scientific certainties, uncertainties, and then they become somehow political certainties by some kind of magic. Well, let me suggest to you that there is actually more behind the magic, namely the fact when anything ever out of science becomes something that a politician, a decision maker cares about is when he's either personally motivated, politically motivated, or sees an economic benefit to it, or on the negative end of things, if he didn't, if he or she ignored these scientific facts, there's a reputational liability, an economic liability, or a legal policy liability or a requirement to do so. In those circumstances, you will get science to matter to politics. And so I think as an honest broker, there's 4 things that we can do. We can be responsive and respond literally to a particular question a policymaker, a decision maker asks us. Can you help me with this? And we can go to our labs, to our field work, whatever, and try to actually answer that. We can also help support it by a lot of background work. And what I mean by that is we can help build the political tide for an issue by educating people, by mobilizing people, by bringing coalitions together. We can also be generative. And what I mean by that is that we give politicians ideas about what they could do, which is a really important thing. In Habermas's terms, this was the emancipatory and notion of what our science can do. You basically open people's minds as to the options that they have. And then this is probably the most difficult one, the most tentative, or not tentative, but it's the most difficult in terms of implementing this and still staying at the table. If you want to criticize someone, the easiest thing to deal with that is to shut the door on you. But to say something, if you do this, it has these negative impacts, or we're keeping track of whether you implement what you said you would. That sort of thing belongs here, and it can be a very important role. So because we're here at a place that deals quite a bit with boundary work, I wanted to simply put this forward. If these are the 4 pieces of work that we do at the science practice interface, these are the kinds of activities that would fall into it. And I bet you that in each one of these boxes, someone here in the room will find themselves what you do. But a lot of the boundary work, I think, is an inherently political space while still dealing with the science. And I think learning to deal with that, or learning to do this in a sophisticated manner, is the hard work. So I wrap up here. The first column here of what success is, that almost is speaks to itself. It's complex, context sensitive, many dimensions to it, not a black and white thing. And it's not just about outcomes or process, but many different aspects to it. Each one of these dimensions I think of as necessary but insufficient conditions by themselves. Certainly not determined by science alone, but it become relevant if we do this interface work well. It certainly requires deliberate and skilled boundary work, and in the political process, I think we can always play a useful role in this way of being responsive, supportive, generative, and/or critical. And so I will maybe leave it with that and just simply mention that the book we just learned yesterday was declared an outstanding academic title for 2014. So I'm damn proud right now. Thank you. Happy to, yeah, so any questions, happy to answer.